the computer, I'm sure, will think black is actually winning. Yes, it says -2 because queen a7 check is coming with two knights that can hop into f2. So even if he plays like rook f1, queen a7 check, king g2, queen b7 check. Now if he tries something like queen f3, you can just play bishop c6, so that's no good. So he has to play something like king g1, queen b6 check, king g2, and now bishop c6 check. And this is just brutal. King h3, knight df2, rook takes f2, knight takes f2 check, king h4. And now we've gotten our exchange back, and after bishop f3, there's nothing he can do to stop, just carnage. Queen h6 check. And then he has to go to here to stop mate, but you just play g5 then, and queen e6, threatening queen h3. So the threat is to play there. So he has to play g4, queen takes e5. Now the threat is here, and he just has to start giving up material. Like h3, you could just play queen h2, and now this threat is renewed, and it's kind of a funny position. So he would have to play g6, queen takes here, king g5, h6 check, and if he plays queen takes, he walks into this mate, so he has to play king takes, knight takes g4 check, king g5, f6 check, king f4, and then we finally win the queen at the end of all that. So hopefully that's an entertaining. But this shows, the kind of tactics that black has here. So in this position, I'm trying to think if there's a game where this has been played. Let's look. I think I did have a model game in this line. Yeah, this game of Fromeyev, even though it's a blitz game that Fromeyev lost, he was actually doing fine in this game. So for example, h3, the idea is that he now wants to play this move, e5, without allowing knight g4. But it turns out that black had a really strong move here, which is just to play, you can just play b4. And if the knight moves to d5, you just take it. If he plays e5, you can take here. E takes f6, rook b8, and b takes c3, queen takes f6, and this is just a wonderful position. This knight on d3 is just awesome. But the move that Afromeyev played, bishop c6, is pretty good too. After bishop e3, again, this move b4 is really strong. Rook e8, e5, takes on g2, queen takes g2, knight d7. But even here, black is probably slightly better. But he should have played this move b4. So this just shows, like, probably f4 is not even the best move here because it just lets black occupy d3. I mean, it was the best move in the line without rook d1 and when black hadn't castled, but having thrown in rook d1 and castles, at this point he should probably change plans. And in fact, the computer is recommending bishop f4 and saying black is only a little better after knight d3, because he can play e5 here, knight g4, and then it's recommending to just sacrifice. Because if we move this rook, yeah, actually it's saying that white is okay here. After something like bishop e6, queen c2, rook b8. So I wonder, we might have a better move than knight d3 though, like maybe just queen e7 here, and just hang on to everything. And you can maybe try like knight d5, but this probably doesn't work out so well because it lets us get this our ideal position here, which is this rook on e8 and then the bishop back on c8. So this looks pretty good. So yeah, I think that rook d1 is not as testing because this e4 plan can just be met by e5, and it's pretty much all that's been played. So again, e4, e5 is definitely strong in this situation. Like, this is stronger than playing bishop to e7. In the main line, it's not clear. Like in the main line, which is queen e2, knight c3, queen e2, and then e4. The main line has been this bishop e7 move. But I still think this e5 with my queen e7 novelty, I think this e5 line is pretty strong. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at the e3 variation, and that I've explained the ideas in the opening well, and shown that black has very dynamic play. Once he stops white on the king side, he has dynamic play on the queen side. And in my second video in this series, I'm going to talk about knight c3, which is Boris Avrick's recommendation in Grandmaster Repertoire. So I'm going to talk about knight c3. And also I'll look at the other moves, the other ideas like a4 ideas, knight a, and the sideline of knight a3. And then in the last video, I'm going to look at knight e5 ideas and queen a4 check. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I will see you in the second video. Hey guys, what's up? This is Casio. This is going to be my second video in my Declawing the Catalan series. So I've already explained, the first 6 moves, and so I'm going to be going through knight c3 in this video. In the last video, we went through e3, and there is one line I forgot to mention, and that is after this queen e2 b5 move, white can throw in knight e5 here, and look at it really quick. I mean, it's hardly been played, so that's why I didn't really mention it, but you can play knight d5 and white can take on d7, but I'm recommending sacking the exchange, like so. So there's this game, Jansen Pickett, 1999, if you want to see any more details. And I just think that, black's knight and his light square bishop are the equivalent of, here he has 2 powerful bishops and the pawns on the queen side, and so should be doing well, and you can look at that on your own if you like. So what do we want to play after knight c3? If you'll remember that when white played e3, we responded with bishop d7 because there was this threat of knight d2. But here now, what we really want to play is this move rook b8, because if white plays knight d2, here we can just take the pawn here, and actually queen takes is probably the right way to do it, because we just double check with the computer, but well, you can play bishop takes c6 check. So let's double check. Yeah, I guess that's still probably the best way to take. But point is, he's up now 2 pawns, and so that it just doesn't work there. So we don't have to worry about knight d2, and we can just play rook b8. The idea behind rook b8 is now if white plays knight e5, we can just take it. So for example, if he plays knight e5, we can just play knight takes e5, d takes e5, trade queens, and then play back to d7. And in this position, we're still up a pawn. It's really not easy to see how white's going to get this pawn back either, and we're pressurizing this pawn. This move has probably been played if we look in the database. Let it catch up here. So it's been played a few times. In fact, Rogers beat Barsov with it, it looks like. But in a more recent game, it looks like Barsov won. And essentially here, he did get his pawn back, but in this position, black appears to be doing fine. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that because it's not a popular move, but if you just remember that the basic idea is not to take on d4, as we saw on the other line. When white plays e5, you generally take it with the knight. That's why you played knight c6, is to take off that knight and trade queens and play knight d7. But the main idea behind knight c3 is to play this move e2 to e4. So what's the idea behind e4? It's basically to eventually play d5, and after black will be pretty much forced to play e takes d5, and then white will either take back and get a pawn spike in black's position, with this pawn on d5, or in some lines he'll push e5, and it kind of depends on how well supported the e5 square is. If white has played queen e2, then he tends to prefer the e5 plan with queen e2 and rook d1, but if he pushes d5 immediately, then the the ED plan is more common. So the most popular move here is in fact to play a d5 immediately, to which we pretty much have to take, and he takes back, and then we play this move knight b4. So one of the key ideas in this e4 d5 line is control of this square d3. White will try to keep black's, eventually get rid of black's knight, and black will try to keep it there if he can and control a lot of these light squares. Now, one of the reasons that white plays this d5 immediately is because it's really hard to defend this pawn. For example, if white plays knight e5, which is the main line immediately, he attacks this pawn. And we can't really play b5 because after a move like a3, knight d3, like say something like this, then white comes into c6 and he forks our queen and our rook. So we can't really play b5 here with the knight on e5, and by driving our knight away from c6, we no longer can take this knight off on e5. But all is not lost. After the move bishop f5, white will play a3 just to drive the piece away, and knight d3, and then he'll take on c4. So what's going on in this position? Well, white has this advanced pawn on d5, and it kind of has this restrictive effect on black's queenside pawns. In a lot of these lines, black could make a passed pawn pretty easily, and white had kingside play. Here, the position isn't really about white's kingside play. It's kind of a mutual stalemate on the queen side. White doesn't really have a breakthrough either with any of these three pawns, and nor does black. So the position is just such that they're kind of stopping each other. And if we look in the database, the main move here is simply to take on c1. And this probably leads to pretty equal positions after castles. I think rook e1 has been played, b4 has been played. But one of the common plans is simply to play this move knight e8. And then we can find some game here, most likely. Like here's a Barre of Adams game. The idea is to eventually to put the knight on d6. And here it blockades. And either way, if white takes, or you're going to take if he doesn't take, and you're going to put the bishop on the d6 square. So this just reaches a very dry, equal position. It's hard to imagine how either side can really make progress here. It's opposite colored bishops. There's no real pawn breaks. The e-file is totally open, and this is just pretty much a dead position. So what I'm going to propose is something different, where you don't jump to get the bishop pair and go after this knight e8 d6 idea, which is certainly quite playable, and if you want to look at it on your own and decide to play that, you can. But I'm going to suggest an interesting novelty, namely that just to go ahead and castling is not a novelty, and then b4 is the main line. One of the reasons they play b4 is they'd like to move the bishop to get it out of take, but that can walk into lines with knight takes b2. It's still playable here because on knight takes b2, oh yeah, the knight is still guarding it. So, but one idea here is b5, knight a5. We still can't take here because after a move like this, he can come into c6, and maybe that's playable. But I think that what I'm going to recommend is a novelty here against either bishop e3 or against b4, which I think are the two best moves, because otherwise, you're eventually you have the option to just take here anyway. So white's generally going to try to do something about that bishop. So let's suppose he just moves it here. I'm recommending this novelty of queen d7. The idea behind queen d7 is to play b5, b4, if allowed, and because this knight on d3, white will generally play to try to dislodge it, with moves like queen e2 and rook a1. So the idea is to very quickly force in b5, b4. It gives this rook something to do, so it's not just, doing nothing on b8. And in addition, after a move like a takes b4, we have knight takes b4. So that's the basic idea. If you were to now play something like, queen e2, then I think b5 is interesting. And when he plays something like knight a5, we can just push b4. And I think that this leads to an okay position for black, after a takes b4, knight takes b4. And the computer is thinking white has a little bit of an edge. We might have, but as it goes on and the depth goes up, it realizes that he doesn't have much. After something like, we threaten to play